Welcome to our last panel of the day entitled Night Owls. And unlike the owls that we listened to earlier in the day, we're talking about humans this time and the activities that they engage in at night. So we're just going to kind of briefly introduce our three and then jump in. We have Geoff Manaugh up first to talk about burglary. And then Jorge Leal to talk about Chicano politics in the city. And finally, Francesca Harding to talk about scenes of LA at night. So we'll jump right in and save as much time for questions as we can. Geoff.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a really exciting series of events, and I've had the honor of participating in another one as a speaker and one prior to that as a moderator. So it's great to be back, and thanks to everybody for taking the time to listen to discussions of the night on a particularly beautiful November afternoon. I'm going to do something slightly different than I normally do, which is actually mostly read some notes, which hopefully isn't a fatal departure from speaking precedent. But I just thought it'd be a better way to go through some of the topics that I'd be looking at today. By way of just a very brief self-introduction, a couple years ago I wrote and published a book called A Burglar's Guide to the City that looked specifically at burglary and its relationship to urban and built environments. So how burglars get into buildings, how police track them, and how we can keep burglars from breaking into architectural structures. But I'm going to go into some of the themes in this talk, and then we can also talk about that afterward in the Q&A. So it seems particularly appropriate to discuss burglary's relationship to the night in the sense that burglary was once legally defined very specifically as a crime that only occurs after the sun goes down. In other words, you could break into someone else's house and steal everything in sight, but if you did it during the day, your act would still be illegal, it just would not be considered burglary. Although this is no longer true legally speaking, burglary at one point required darkness. Burglary also has an interesting etymological connection with the very idea of urbanism, or the city itself. The word burglar descends from the same root word that gave us burg or borough. Think Edinburgh, Scotland, Newburgh, New York, Hamburg, Germany, or the burghers of medieval English, meaning a city dweller. Even the word bourgeois is etymologically related to burglary. Burglary, in other words, is conceptually wired into both the city and the night. Burglary is an etymological part of the city. What's more, as I'll explore very briefly here today, burglary cannot exist without architecture. Burglary is not the same thing as theft. Burglary is simply the commission of a crime inside a building that you do not have permission to be inside. Burglary requires architecture because it is a fundamentally indoor activity. This has had several wide-ranging legal effects. Proving whether or not someone was inside a building during the commission of a crime has led generations of creative lawyers to argue for all sorts of revisions to the idea of inside and outside, including when the act of entry really occurs, and to the very definition of a building. In a few cases I found while researching my book, it has even led to legal arguments about whether, when their client committed a particular crime, the tiniest fraction of a single human body part had crossed this invisible line between the world at large and a private interior. In one interesting case, it was actually the tip of a man's finger. He was threatening a homeowner while leaning on the windowsill, and the tip of his finger crossed the invisible line into the interior. And since that's a crime that was inside the person's house, that was burglary. To talk about burglary, then, is a roundabout way of talking about architecture, talking about space, talking about darkness, and talking about the city. This is a human body, by the way. It's someone breaking into a house. As that opening graphic that we just saw hopefully implied, part of this comes from the fact that there is perennial fascination with how burglars operate. That is, how burglars use and abuse architecture. How does the burglar get into your house, that previous graphic wanted to know? The very question suggests that somehow, all around us, there are ways of using buildings that remain invisible to us, law-abiding citizens. Indeed, burglars seem to consistently reveal different ways of entering and using architecture. They'll go in through the window rather than using the door. They'll cut holes directly through the drywall of a neighboring apartment or business. They'll even sneak down an air vent, or sometimes simply walk around back and come in through a door you didn't think you needed to lock that night. By acting this way, burglars revel in a kind of tactical rethinking of architecture and urban space itself. A getaway route, for example, is really nothing more than just a strategic rethinking of streets and alleyways, of how one neighborhood is connected to another in surprising or overlooked ways. For burglars, in other words, buildings are like puzzles to be solved, and cities are like game environments to conquer. Burglars simultaneously weaponize loitering. That is, they wait, endlessly patient for the perfect opportunity, for just the right window to be left unlocked or open, at the same time that they take advantage of extreme specificity in targeting, hitting exactly the right house at exactly the right intersection to avoid being seen by returning homeowners or police, finding a perfectly shadowed door or an unprotected backyard from which to strike. For a burglar, selecting targets is often just a different way of studying the city and how its streets and buildings were designed. On the other hand, it is this very specificity, this ability to predict what a burglar might target next, that allows us to develop new ways of defending ourselves from potential trespass and violation. It's why we know to lock our doors and windows or to put lights on timers when we're away for the night. One interesting example of this predictability comes from the United Kingdom in a fascinating phenomenon called capture houses. To make a long story short, a capture house is a fake apartment or house run by the local police department, where the interior has been kitted out to appeal to a specific burglar's MO. In other words, if someone in your neighborhood has been breaking into houses at night by climbing in through a window to steal an iPad, then to make an effective capture house, you might leave a window slightly cracked and put an iPad out on the table. You might also cover everything with ultraviolet tagging liquid. Then you wait, watching everything through hidden cameras. And there you have it. It's a capture house, a simulated domestic world, an empty apartment with its lights burning long past midnight, a kind of authoritarian stage set under perpetual surveillance by the police. I should add briefly, too, that some of these capture houses are effective within 24 hours. They'll open it and they'll catch the burglar the next day. In other cases, the capture house ran for more than a year and never caught the burglar until they finally just closed it down. While we're on the subject of police, how police see the city at night is its own fascinating topic. I don't want to go into too much of this research here, as it came up during the previous conference, which was about being over LA and looking down at Los Angeles. But there are a couple things that I want to mention for the relevance for today's topic. Several years ago, I was able to fly with the LAPD on multiple helicopter patrols, including 2 night flights. Navigating Los Angeles from above in the darkness, looking for criminals, turns out to be an on-the-fly combination of visual flight rules, digital navigation techniques, including the moving map that you can see on the dashboard of this helicopter, advanced visualization tools such as body heat cameras, electromagnetic snooping, such as looking for LoJack signals being broadcast by stolen vehicles, and cartographic rules of thumb. An example of this latter technique are the rules of 4, an esoteric name for something that is basically a way of accurately guessing the address of a house or business that you otherwise have never been to before. I should add very briefly, too, one of the interesting things we did at night in Los Angeles while waiting for criminals is they called it the curse of the ride-along, which is that the minute they have a ride-along in either a police car or a police helicopter, no one's committing any crimes. And so just like there's absolutely nothing to do. On one, and I have a shot of this coming up, but in fact, it might be the next, oh no, it's not. But one night they gave me an architectural tour because they knew I was writing about architecture. But then the other night we just sort of parked over the Hollywood freeway, just sort of like fishing in the darkness, waiting for LoJack signals to pop up because there was nothing else to do. So if somebody had stolen a car, they'd drive by beneath the helicopter, we'd pick it up and chase them. In any case, so in terms of the topic today, the city at night, I want to focus briefly on the role street lighting plays in law enforcement. Several of the tactical flight officers I met during my research commented on the transition currently underway as Los Angeles moves from incandescent streetlights to LED. This is literally changing what the city looks like from above. On one level, the transition to LEDs is illuminating borders between the city of LA and other independent towns and municipalities, for example, Culver City, Santa Monica. Places that have not yet made the jump to LEDs still burn at a warmer, more yellow frequency. From above, that means entire neighborhoods can seem like nostalgic, sepia-toned islands amidst a sea of gleaming white light. On another level, though, this has tactical effects. One officer pointed out to me that it's much easier to see people in the LED light, which is both crisper and brighter. The unspoken implication here was that if you want to avoid being seen by police helicopters, you might want to stick to parts of the city that are still lit by incandescent bulbs. It will be easier to hide there. This was part of the architecture tour where they didn't know what to do because there were no crimes happening, so they're like, let's go see the Hollywood sign. There's one other point I want to mention briefly, though, about smart lighting grids and the relationship between street lighting and law enforcement. Several years ago, for a different research project, I spoke to a major American lighting firm that at that time was pioneering the use of remotely controlled smart lights in a Californian city. One thing they highlighted to me was police control of these future streetlights. For example, police would have the ability to ramp up the light levels in a particular neighborhood, even on specific streets or city blocks. The example given to me was that police might want to highlight a specific walking route for people leaving a sports stadium or a major public event. But it was acknowledged that this could also be used to aid police in a manhunt for a fleeing criminal, or perhaps to help identify protesters and rioters. Of course, this also means that the police could turn off all the lights in a specific part of town to assist with police night vision, or for that matter, to use selective police-induced blackouts for other possibly nefarious political reasons. In any case, the police use of streetlights might sound ominous, but it should not be surprising. For example, Paris, the city of light, arguably takes that nickname from a street lighting campaign implemented as part of a 17th century police operation, an innovative new patrol tool conceived by Louis XIV's Lieutenant General of Police. There is something slightly surreal in the idea that what is allegedly the world's most romantic city takes its nickname from a police operation. Paris is the city of light because authorities wanted it that way. Finally, I wanted to end with a brief note about the imaginative role played by burglars. As Hollywood films and heists featured on the evening news make clear, pop culture is seemingly obsessed with discovering new ways that burglars might be targeting us, with learning new tricks burglars might try, or new ways that burglars might get into your house, if you recall the opening slide. In this case that you see here, it's an old newspaper, somewhat ironically published on September 11th, albeit 90 years ago. It was just an interesting date. We see an old newspaper warning that burglars might soon start robbing the city from above, using silent airplanes, basically gliders, to land on high-rise buildings at night and sneak down into the depths to rob unsuspecting residents. The article even advocates that civilians should band together to start a kind of late-night skyline league, sitting up on their roofs in the darkness, binoculars in hand, waiting for burglars to descend from above. As I hope these brief thoughts make clear, when it comes to burglars, the urban imagination has always been haunted by their imminent arrival. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can talk more about this in the Q&A. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for sticking around. Also, thank you to my students for showing up. I mean, the power of extra credit is real today. They're genuinely interested in what I'll be talking about. So today, when Bill Devereaux invited me to this symposium, it was actually a moment of really rethinking of my research. And I hadn't really thought about that a lot of my research or what I have studied actually happens at night in Los Angeles. So really, that question of what is the relationship of Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, and particularly Latinx youth and the night? Or what does the LA night offers Latinx in Los Angeles? So I was thinking about this question, and I admit that I have done plenty of field research on this. And so this is actually myself. As a teenager, like 5 years ago, more like 25 years ago. And here is, I'm attending a tocada, a music gig in Chinatown. And yes, that's in front of the now famous for punk rock shows, Hong Kong Cafe. That by the 1990s, it was called the Hong Kong Low. And this, in the 1970s, was the epicenter of punk rock. That's the central plaza in Chinatown. But by the 1990s, it had become the epicenter of rock angelino. That is the Los Angeles brand of Latin American rock or rock and roll. And this is what it looked outside. That's my high school friends and me being my typical dark self. But I also want to show you how not only the city looked at night, but it also sounded at night. So this is what it sounded like at night. This is rock urbano, which is a particular brand of rock and roll from the Mexican working class periphery. And check out those dance moves, which are quite amazing and snazzy. And also you'll see on the walls the iconography of the Hong Kong Cafe. And I have to tell you that actually this is my research as a PhD student, but I came to it rather late in my career. If we have discussed this a couple of years ago, I'll be like, I lived through that, but I'm never going to study that. I mean, it's something that I went through this. But the more I was thinking about this, I started thinking about the relationship between Los Angeles youth as a way of placemaking, space making, and also the politics of this. So as I began doing this research as a participant at that moment, I took it up as an academic project, and I started documenting this, researching this, and pretty soon I opened up this Instagram account that developed in this public scholarship project, which I call Rock Archivo LA, which is a crowdsourced account where I share photos, people also send me photos, flyers, tickets, and other ephemera, along with captions that connect. I write captions that connected to the larger historical period. And a lot of this actually happens at night. This type of scholarship, for me, it allows us to examine and visualize how the creators of these flyers, the participants to these events, either immigrants or latter generations Latinx, mapped out and respatialized their own metropolis at this time in the 1990s. And yes, I'm showing you maps that were created by the organizers of these events. And so this is a moment of the 1990s before we had Google Maps, Waze, and all the good things that, where we can find an actual address. So for me, it's really interesting to think about how they respatialized, they created this new alternative cartography, sonically, through sound, but also through their own map making. Most of the time, as these events happen at night. So how would you find an address in Los Angeles that in the middle of the night? And I think that today we have heard some, different conversations about the ephemerality of certain spaces in Los Angeles, but also the way mammals and ourselves, humans, create and remap Los Angeles, right? So in here I'm showing you some of these maps, which I find quite interesting as they're either in Spanish, English, or Spanglish, but if you notice at the bottom of this, you see the Mountain Freeway, and it says rush hour, right? So just thinking all these temporalities that are present in these maps. And what I think about when I think of Latinx and its relationship to the LA night, it is this space making, these places that in the absence of formal venues in predominantly Latinx neighborhoods, or also because of the social segregation in terms of the impossibility or not feeling welcome in formal music venues in the West Side, in Hollywood, they created their own venues, which I call ephemeral forums. These were either rundown restaurants, auto shops. I have found evidence of funerary homes where these music gigs took place. And what you see here is how youth travel, Latinx youth travel through these different neighborhoods at night to these places. To come together, yes, to dance syncopated rhythms of either ska or punk rock beats. And in doing so, they asserted their belonging in Los Angeles. So in here I have two photos of this ephemeral forum in Southgate, California, in the southeast part of Los Angeles. And what I find interesting about these two photos is, one, just the technology, the kind of technology that we see here, but also we see this portrait right here on the image over there, where that dude is like on top of the speakers, right? Which is Carlos Gardel, which we can argue is the first pan-Latino music star, a tango music star from the 1930s, and how his appearance comes to kind of bless these happenings in Southeast Los Angeles. So what happened in these forums, in these places? Yes, a lot of people, a lot of these Latina youth went as a way to to spend time with each other, some leisure time. But what's interesting about this is that it allowed possibilities that formal spaces or venues did not, particularly, yes, in the middle of the night. One, they were all ages. This obviously allowed for people that were in their teenage years, that perhaps were a little older to attend to these venues. But then the other part about all ages is that because it did not ask for a requisite in terms of an ID, people that perhaps their legal status was not perhaps formalized or authorized, could attend these venues, these music shows, that otherwise they would not be able to do so in formal venues such as the Roxy, the Whiskey, or present-day music venues in Echo Park. So while a lot of the attendees might have just gone for the leisure, others took it upon to create a collectivity, to also create solidarities at a moment of explosive xenophobia and also anti-immigrant sentiment. No, we're not talking about 2016 or 17. We're thinking of Los Angeles in 1994 with the inclusion of Proposition 187 in the ballot, this anti-immigrant proposition. And so what you see in these ephemeral venues, it is this, one, the solidarity. People going into these shows with this clenched teeth attitude of, we are feeling besieged, we're feeling under attack in the city or in the state, but also how are we going to organize to counter this anti-immigrant policy, and also sentiment in the city and in the state. So you see a lot of political activism taking root in this in these spaces. So one in here in the left side, I'm showing you a flyer for a concert, a benefit concert for the campaign against Prop 187, mostly in Spanish, and this happens in the city of Huntington Park, featuring Mexico City's own Maldita Vecindad. And on the right, 6 years later, what you have is a punk rock gig here in South LA. And you see that it is a flyer of a punk rock flyer, but there is a definite message of organizing on, against police brutality, something that Black and brown youth have constantly been target of, particularly here in South LA. So throughout these ephemeral forums, Latinx have made spatial claims in the metropolis, and also continue this exchange of cultural expressions and political advocacy in the 1990s, in the aughts, and all the way to the present. So we can see some of that activism taking place around 94, later on in 96, as the passage of IRIRA, this federal legislation that further criminalized immigrants, and being together in these spaces. As precarious, as ephemeral as they were, Latinx youth were able to let off steam after a long day of hard work, taxing labor, perhaps being ignored in the city. And then they became politicized in these gigs. And as not only the participants, but also bands touch on the issues of racism, police abuse, immigration bashing in their songs. In addition, they addressed the urgent need of more democratic societies in Latin America. So we did see this transnational circuit of ideas and politics being shared across borders. So in the years after, we see that organizers and participants of the become intergenerational organizers during first in the 96 anti-proposition marches of 94, but also in the 2000 immigration reform marches, which become the biggest civil rights manifestations in the history of the U.S., with the largest demonstration here in downtown Los Angeles that gathered over 1 million participants. So now, to conclude, in the Los Angeles night, Latinx youth have created, share, and enjoy cultural expressions that they have employed as these strategic, symbolic, and spatial manifestations of solidarity among themselves and other marginalized groups. And also, at night, they have made their visibility and presence in Los Angeles. These cultural expressions have created bridges of solidarities by Latinx of different national origins, citizenships, and legal migratory statuses. Thus, I think that the LA Night offers us something, that their activities, either in ephemeral forums or as part of the LA Night, Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, helps us broaden our understanding of what the Los Angeles, Latino Los Angeles is, beyond the confines of Latinos, Latinas as mere laborers, or just immigrants, or solely social activists. Rather, Latinx youth were and are multifaceted active agents in the city and life of Los Angeles, who are instrumental in the creation of Los Angeles in the 21st century. Thank you for your time.
One, two, 1, 2. Hi, guys. You guys can hear me okay? Thanks for having me. My name is Francesca. I'm a DJ. I've been DJing for about 10 years now, maybe a little bit longer. And I'm also in the trailer world. So I work on film and TV trailers in the music department. So basically doing music supervision. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm really also happy to be going after Jorge because some of the stuff that I wanted to just briefly mention today in my comments to you has to do with what you were just talking about as well. And so I just wanted to talk about what I'm really excited about in terms of the LA music underground scene. So again, I've been DJing for about 10 years. And when I first began DJing, well, you know, every DJ starts out in their bedroom, DJing for like their plants and books. So when I, finally saw the light of day, or in this case, was able to finally start playing out in the night. Very quickly afterwards, me and some friends of mine, we got together, we decided we wanted to throw a party, and we were having a very casual conversation about what the musical direction of this party should be. And in just having this very, natural, authentic conversation, we realized that we were all listening to the music that our parents played for us. For added context, my parents are Black, Central Americans, we're Panamanians. And so I grew up listening to a lot of salsa and bachata and dance hall and reggae. And we were realizing that in these club spaces that were mainstream, we weren't necessarily hearing those types of music. It was a lot of EDM, it was a lot of top 40 hip hop, which was fine, but we really wanted to create a space where we were listening to music that we knew and was familiar. So we started a party, it was called Bodega. And again, this was 10 years ago, but immediately it became really popular and people were gravitating toward it. And in taking a step back and figuring out why it became so popular so quickly, it became apparent to me that not intentionally, but we had created the safe space where people were able to come and express their racial and cultural identity, and how important that was, and how that is essentially a political thing, right? To be able to come and express your sexual orientation or your gender identity or your racial and cultural identity in a way that, didn't make you want to shrink, but allowed you the space to do that. And so from that aha moment, that's kind of the narrative that I've been trying to push forward in my DJ career. So I have been a part of DJ curriculum is called Intersessions Women of Color in Canada. She started it. And Intersessions is this kind of curriculum that targets LGBT youth and people of color to teach them how to DJ, to teach them how to produce. When you look at like a DJ culture and festivals, you really see it being a male kind of dominant arena. And so how do you kind of level that playing field, right? And give really talented people who wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to be out and DJing those opportunities. I also started another party at the Lash. I don't know if anyone's partied at the Lash before. Raise your hand. It's in downtown. I'm sure you've been there. And Skid Row adjacent, but it's this 2-room venue. It's really welcoming. There was a very historic party that was there for a while called Mustache Mondays, where, you know, people, specifically LGBT folk could come, but trans people, people of color who were trans, who were necessarily finding a home, right, in these West Hollywood clubs, could come and again, just like reclaim their identities and their sort of sexual orientation. And you want to feel like it's like a home thing, and you can be yourself. And so it really excites me that the LA music underground scene is continuing this idea and these practices of being intentional in claiming these spaces for our own. You know, when I go out, because I feel like when you think about clubs, you think about hedonism and people, I don't know, maybe making out in a club, or it's not necessarily spaces where you think, hey, real things are happening. But I would argue the opposite. I would argue that these are now our political centers. You go to a club and folks are talking, you know, what's happening with the presidencies. We're talking about the next election. We're talking about ourselves and how dynamic we are in terms of the intersection of race and politics and gender. And so I think still what was happening in the 90s and before in terms of the threat of that becomes venue spaces and what we have access to. There was just an article in the LA Times, I think this week, where they were talking about the Lyric Theater, which was like this great place, you know, for like indie artists to go and perform, and it shut down because it's really difficult for some of these left of center venues to operate and be able to sustain themselves with outside pressures. I think the Echo in Echo Park was just sold to Live Nation. So, you know, what do you do when you have these ideas about creating spaces, safe spaces, and a lot of times traditional venues are not accessible to us. But then you need capital, right, for maybe a warehouse space to operate some of these parties that you want to throw, you know, or sometimes some of these alternative venues can be a little bit dangerous if you don't have the right security, you know, if you don't have the right permit. And so I think that relationship between figuring out how to have these intentional spaces, but doing so in a way that is safe physically for everyone, and finding the kind of venue capital that you need is still an ongoing conversation. But, you know, I'm old now, but I see like, I mean, aren't we all? But, you know, I see like young people still kind of pushing those boundaries, and it's really exciting. And I think that it's something that I wish more people would pay attention to, because again, I believe that these are very important social and political centers that can't be discounted. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you. Let's open it up to questions. And like we were doing earlier, we are recording the audio, so I'll bring the microphone to you. Who would like to start? Oh, I see Bill's hand in the back. This is when I get my exercise.
I have a question for Geoff, and you may not, it's not quite the topic of your book or remarks today, so you may not know how to get at it. But the burglars that do their work at night, obviously we would expect their casing, as you showed, the loitering, the kind of very highly deliberative loitering or whatever. Do you know if there's any studies on a burglar's brain to see if they're particularly nocturnal? You know, the way earlier today we heard about plants. Certain plants do certain things at certain times of night that other plants don't. Do you think there's a biological or physiological potential or difference?
I mean, the number of studies of burglars is actually pretty endless. They come out all the time, and there's always some new statistical insight that someone wants to offer. One of the ones that I actually kind of mock in my book was a paper that came out from a Chinese research institute that was looking at when burglaries happen, and basically it happened between, it was something like 87% of burglaries happen between when the temperature is either like 0 degrees or 86 degrees. So in other words, like basically that's almost literally every day of the year. So of course that's when burglaries are going to happen. But I think in terms of, even though I'm covering burglary at night, and I mentioned that there used to be a legal connection between nighttime and burglary, which no longer exists. So you can be a burglar in the middle of the day. There is a lot of burglary during the day. In fact, arguably, there's even more burglary during the day because it's when you're down at the office. It's when people see you, hopping into an Uber to go to LAX, and then they just rob your apartment. So it definitely comes at any hour and isn't necessarily, a reflection of someone who's more nocturnal than someone else. Then there are also nocturnal people that don't burglarize. So I think the other thing that I kind of, I say with a slight mocking tone in the book is that, it might just be a different form of neurodiversity, like someone who is unable to perceive a boundary between inside and outside, or between yours and theirs, and that they just and that they are constantly tripping over that line, and that maybe that's where the burglary lies psychologically.
And in your research, you've seen that architecture has molded to better withstand burglaries. How has architecture as a field changed because of burglary?
Well, it's funny. It hasn't really that much. What's interesting actually is that for every innovation in architecture, burglars just have a counter innovation, and then vice versa. And then for every high-rise building that implements surveillance cameras, gate locks, even on ladders and that kind of stuff to keep people from climbing up to the third or fourth floor. There's a way around that. But instead, I find that a lot of architects, and just a very brief answer is that most architects kind of they'll give this question to the aftermarket world. So what they'll say is, it's not my responsibility if somebody breaks into your house. I'm going to design an all glass wall, or I'm going to design a back door that gets into your house that's down a corridor that you never walk down, and we're going to plant trees in the backyard so that a neighbor can't see it. It's a huge security risk, but that's not the architect's responsibility. Instead, they know that you're going to get a Ring doorbell, or you're going to get a surveillance camera, or you're going to buy a dog, and it's these aftermarket solutions that are kind of attempts to solve the burglary problem. And so you could actually, in fact, make the argument that if more architects took burglary seriously, there would be more elegant design solutions to it as a security flaw. Instead, you just get bars on windows and that kind of thing that are never. An architect doesn't want to put bars on the windows in the front of a house, but the homeowner does because the architect didn't think about that. Sure.
Great. Do we have another question?
So what do you think architects ought to do?
Well, I think honestly they should just take burglary seriously as a way of thinking that there are people that want to get into buildings in ways that the architect hasn't thought about, or the homeowner. So that might mean even fortifying certain walls around. Because the funny thing is that we lock our doors and windows as if a burglar is going to walk up to a house, see that, and just move away. Whereas instead you see, especially with commercial structures, instead they'll just cut through the drywall next to the door. So the door you might have 6 padlocks on it, or not padlocks, 6 deadbolts on it. But if it's just drywall and 2x4s right to the left, you just go through the wall. Or you'll just come down through the ceiling in a skylight or that kind of thing. But I think it's really just a question of thinking about security vulnerabilities as a spatial challenge, and then finding elegant ways to solve that through design. So that's materials, that's lines of sight. It depends too. Then there's this, it can go slightly ominous in one direction where police, in particular in the United Kingdom, offer almost like design consultation services for new suburban houses and that kind of thing. And there's an entire field called, the anagram is CPTED, C-P-T-E-D. And because I'm speaking in public, I've now blanked on what it stands for. But it's like community policing and something to do with design and securing the built environment. But in any case, that can go to the point where, police are now designing the cities that we live in. So that could go a little bit too far. But I think those are the kinds of things that one might want to look at. Can I ask a question really quick? One of the things that since we're all making jokes about how old we are, at the risk of revealing how old I am, when I grew up on the East Coast outside Philadelphia, but one of the things that me and my friends used to do in the extreme early 90s was, our parents would go to bed, so we'd take the car, we'd drive to New York City, and we'd go to raves. But what was interesting is that raves, at least in that era, always popped up in incredibly unexpected places. It wasn't always a club. In fact, it was rarely a club. It was a warehouse. It was underneath the footing of a bridge. It was in an abandoned space, that kind of thing. I guess I'm just curious, and this is a question for either one of you, in terms of spaces here in Los Angeles, how are things that are like abandoned architectural sites, peripheral sites, unexpected things like funeral homes, how are they popping up as kind of cultural centers because of the music scene here? And how do they transform at night?
I still see it for sure. I've seen people getting very innovative with the spacing and figuring out very clandestine ways to not only get the word out, but also in throwing these parties. But I will say that as I get older, I'm seeing that a little bit less. A lot of times it's a bit more organized and finding like warehouse spaces as opposed to like the desert parties, although those desert parties do exist. And then, a lot of things are becoming like really monetized very quickly. So, like the Burning Mans of the world for sure happen. So it'll be like this little kind of gathering of folks that has a very intimate feeling. And then 5 years later, it's a bit of a circus. But I know that they definitely still exist for sure. And people are getting very innovative.
And for my part, I have seen that when we think of raves, we think of, oh yes, there's an abandoned warehouse, right? And I have found in the record some of those, but others are how we use the same space for different purposes at different points in the day or at night, right? So a couple of places that come to mind. It was a mattress factory. And that it was fully functional, but at night, the siblings of somebody that worked in the mattress were able to get in, and so they were moshing on top of this mattress, and that, and that happened near in unincorporated LA County. The other one is how we understand Los Angeles as a very urban place, but it has a lot of semi-rural spaces. And this is not only in the periphery. Compton has, I didn't know until I started looking at these flyers, that there's a farm. So there's this place where people actually have horses. And so in this kind of stables type of places, that during the day they're actually light animals, you'd have done some music venues. And then the one that I can never get my mind out of, and I wish I would have gone, it was this funeral place, right, where there were actually caskets. And so the music was going on as there were caskets around. So you can imagine. So I guess for me, it is to think of the moment of, gentrification that has gone on in the last 20 years in Los Angeles, and how some of those places have, like the lofts and the warehouses that are no longer as accessible. And so where people go and use either factories or employment spaces or spaces where animals would be during the day, and then they repurpose them for these particular hours.
So Geoff, this isn't much of a question, but as a handyman, I've often had to break into houses to help homeowners, and I would have to think like a burglar. I would have to find the easiest point of access. I wouldn't want to damage the house. I wouldn't want to attract the attention of the neighbors or the police. And then contrasting that, the number of times working as a handyman where I've been accosted by the police for looking like a burglar. So, sorry, it's not a question, but it's just an amazing subject to me, and you cover it very well.
Well, no, it's funny. I mean, I feel like at least at one point in all of our lives, I feel like we've all fought like burglars. Whether it's sneaking out of the house in the middle of the night without waking up our parents or siblings, or sneaking back into the house for that matter, or just finding some way to even just get through an architectural environment without drawing attention to ourselves. That kind of strategic way of using space, that strategic way of getting into something, I think is just shows that burglary. Almost to go back to the first question, it's maybe not a psychological issue, but it's just a frame of mind in terms of thinking about how to misuse, or sort of tactically get through space.
We have time for a couple more questions. Oh, I see one.
Hi, this is for Jorge and Francesca. I was wondering if you both, or if either of you thought that have the tools of community organizing that you see people using and like youth culture using, have they changed over the last, I don't know, few years, like few decades? Or is it basically the same? Or I guess, how have you seen that transition?
Sure. I have thought about this very intently because I look at the 90s and the early part of the 2000s, right? And just in terms of even my archive or what would be my sources, now I started in 2004, 2005 with the advent of MySpace. The physical flyers and decreased. So now there's no, and also the tickets, which would be evidence, right, of this. And also maps. Maps disappear from flyers. So these are three, that tells us how social media has been generative to create this this organizing, perhaps not only in the political activism, but organizing to tell people this is where things are happening, but also makes it even much more ephemeral for me to be able to document, right? And also sometimes our over-reliance to this does not leave us records. So a couple of things about this is that some music venues or shows, they actually now charge for tickets as a souvenir, because most of the times now we don't have tickets. We get an email or we get a text message, or with an app we go in with a scan code, right? So that has changed. I mean, in terms of me being able to document this, right? But in other ways, I think social media has made it a lot easier, where people can congregate, and get the word out, but also sometimes that might be deceiving in terms of, like, you could get 1,000 likes and 1,000 RSVPs on an event on Facebook, and then 10 people showed up, right? So it makes it a lot wider in terms of the reach, but perhaps less commitment sometimes. That's my experience.
Yeah, I would co-sign what you just said. I think, like as a DJ, one of the things that you want to do if you're trying to document your party, right? It's like, let's get like the best video content that we can, and let's get the best action shots that we can get in dialoguing with other people about what's happening in this space. And I feel like it's kind of a tricky line if you're trying to have an intentional space that's really safe for people to come and express themselves, but then you also want to document that safe space for others. I think it can be kind of a tricky line to toe, and I think it's kind of an equation that we haven't necessarily figured out yet, and one that we need to continue to dialogue about. But I think with social media, it's the great gift and it's the great curse, right?
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I see a hand.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I'm being annoying. Hey, I have a question for you. So, homeowners will put a sign in front of their homes that say, hey, I have this alarm system. Do you think that really detracts burglars?
I mean, the funny thing with burglary is that it's almost literally everything is like a 50-50 thing. So even like if you put lights on timers, for some burglars, it's like, just in case there's somebody upstairs reading a book at, 9 o'clock on a Thursday, I'm not going to go in. Other burglars see that and they're like, that light has turned on at 9 o'clock every single day for the last 2 weeks that I've been watching this neighborhood, and that's the reason why they're going to break into that house. So it's the same thing with the stickers outside. I guess I wouldn't say it's 50-50 though. I'd say most of the time what you want to do is just make a burglar think twice about your house, even for just a couple seconds, because they'll just say, screw it, and they'll move on to the next one. So if you can give them any sort of momentary deterrence, like a sign that says you've got a burglar alarm, or that there may or may not be a dog out back, or some other kind of exotic animal in the backyard, but even that might attract them, because they'll be like, do you really have a tiger? So it's really kind of playing a psychological game with an unknown adversary, because you have to devise new ways for them not to want to hit your house. But that's even kind of a design innovation, so that people are, well, first of all, like putting up fake signs, like they'll just get a tag like at a thrift shop or from the previous owners of the house and leave it up. Like our house, for example, says we have an alarm system that we don't have, and hopefully my address is not on the flyer. But then there's also like things like, there's a thing that I like called fake TV, which is just this ridiculous light source. It's almost like a children's game, but you plug it in. It's not, as the name implies, it's not a real television, but it looks as if you're watching TV. And so it'll light up the room with like blue and red and different scenes and get brighter and darker. And so it looks like there's somebody watching a television somewhere in your house. But then again, you could also imagine, burglars that might even recognize the signs of a fake television show and seek it out. So in any case, that's a disappointing answer, I suspect, but there is no one way to keep burglars out of a building. It's like for every burglar that is 100% deterred from one thing, you'll find at least one other burglar that will use that as a sign that they know it's uninhabited or that they can break in, or they know how to use that, how to hack that alarm system or that kind of thing.
Please join me in thanking Francesca, Jorge, and Geoff for their panel. So we're going to transition without a break this time, so I'm going to invite them to take a seat, and I am very honored to introduce Lynell George, who will provide us with an afterword summing up today or offering something new.
All right. I am going to leave you with two moods, night moods. One is a personal story, and one is a received story, and they're short, little vignettes. The first is from an essay, a little piece of an essay called "For Now," and I'm actually knitting something into it. I am the daughter of a night owl and share those proclivities. In the after hours, LA steps out of its cliches. I love late night drives on cleared out freeways, the jangle of night fly radio. I love to take a slow roll along Wilshire Boulevard, especially its eastern edges, to bask in the neon, time traveling. It took some effort to get there. At 17, I'd failed my driving test twice, news I shared with no one. In Los Angeles, it felt worse than being held back a grade. So as not to feel so marooned, junior into senior year, I busted. I caged rides from friends in their Pintos, Corollas, and Fairlanes. I was still yearning for a set of keys. It was 1979. College lurked, and I was still 11th hour practicing. My father's urgent directives to cover the brake, ratcheting up my nerves. Third time was a miracle, and though I'd botched the three-point turn, the test administrator showed mercy. Maybe had one time been me. Perhaps knew what it was like to be just so close to being independent, to moving into and defining your own place. Back then, after nightfall in some parts of the city, the air was redolent of ocean, sharp, brackish, and vivid. Even if you were miles and miles away, that scent traveled like radio signals did at night, beyond specific borders. I always look at that phenomenon to mean that all of Los Angeles was ours. If we could reach it, unlock it. That evening of my triumph, the first place I drove to on my own was the ocean, out into the darkness, to the very edges of discernible land. This strip of unremarkable beach had no associations, no history for me. It wasn't a touchstone. And that, I learned, was immeasurably powerful. It was the first pin on a new map. One more part. Moving around LA at night, especially on your own, meant you had mastered some sort of authority at place. I was ready to chart mine. And then now I'm going to drift into a received story, and we're going to go back in time. And I'm a reporter, and part of, for me, the excitement of being a reporter is talking to people about their history here. And sometimes I end up with information that it doesn't fit in a story, and I just carry it around with me like a locket. And this is a piece of a story that has stayed with me for decades, and I'm still trying to figure out a place to put it. But I'm going to share a piece of it with you now. Disobedience. LA Noir for real. Imagine, Mrs. Pleasant tells me 5 decades after the events transpired. Just imagine. You will dress up. You will pull out your summer sleeveless dress, turquoise and white. It looks rich against your skin. Everyone says so. Shoes, something to think about. Slingback, peep toe, kitten heels. as you will be doing some walking. Your young man will show to retrieve you. He will be attired in a light linen suit. You will make your way east to west to Sunset Boulevard. Nat Cole Trio on the radio. You will find parking on the street because you always have, like the starlets do. It will be easy like that. You and your young man meet the others with their dates, dresses in sherbet tones of lime, lemon, and tangerine. There will be a buzz of ketchup and anticipation. You will queue up in front of an entrance to a busy night spot. A simple short velvet rope will seem to be the only thing between you and a leisurely supper, maybe dancing too. It will be such a lovely, soft summer night. No matter what, you will tell yourselves. Time will seem to pass slowly. The palm trees and hills soften into silhouettes. The sky appears to pale before it completely darkens. You will see the soft mood light, the white-jacketed waiters floating back and forth just beyond the door's threshold. You will hear the muffled hum of conversation, laughter, ringing like crystal. After some time, a white man in a black suit and starched white pocket square will emerge. His cologne will precede him. He will tap your young man on the shoulder and extend his hand as if in a handshake, firm and unafraid. Your young man, shoulders squared, will signal with just a raised chin. You all, as a group, step as one, moving away from the door, away from that possibility of the evening, down the sidewalk, across the street. You will move further away from that moment, but the memory will never leave you. They will do it differently here. They will pay you to go somewhere else. No fire hose, no attack dogs, no bare teeth youth shouting. That's what Mrs. Pleasant tells me many, many decades later. The memory's still so fresh, so raw. I have had to wait decades for it to dry, to temper enough for me to put it down in the pages of my own day books. A memory of a memory. You don't forget. A gesture, a tilt to the head that says, just disappear. Move along, please. No scene. Good night. We knew that in Hollywood, they will always pay in crisp, cool bills, folding money. We will take the money, like always, and use it for essential things, tuition, textbooks, next semester's clothes, car repair, to help family or neighbor make rent, maybe just to keep the lights on. This was disobedience, just another shade of it. We will have a lovely, lovely evening on them, unscathed, Mrs. Pleasant said brightly. But the memory, all of it, edged in a tone that I knew, and she meant to make sure I'd know, revealed otherwise. Thank you.
That concludes our night. Thank you very much. Thank you to Gabe and our colleagues across the street at the Natural History Museum. Thanks for coming. Please join me again in one more round for everybody today. It was such a wonderful day.